Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here on day 2 of Rainforest Ambitions. If this is the first Rainforest Ambitions event you're tuning into, welcome. This is World Rainforest Day's 5th anniversary and our first global summit that was built with the goal of bringing together and amplifying the experiences and perspectives of all the players involved in the defense or restoration of tropical rainforests and our planet more broadly. So yesterday, our programming revolved around collaboration and how we can bring together the different identities and disciplines involved in conservation to advance our shared goals. And today we're going a step further and unpacking how collaboration translates into action on the ground, yielding tangible impacts. We have 4 panelists representing 3 organizations whose shared approach to conservation is rooted in collaboration with local or indigenous communities. And I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic to them now to introduce themselves. So Nabil, if you want to pull up the PowerPoint, and we'll get into the session right after.
So thank you so much, Nia, for the introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this panel. And it's a real pleasure to be here with everybody and to share the stage, so to speak, with Teri and Beto and my colleague, Marco Acevedo, who is our Mexico Program Officer. So next slide. So very brief. This is just meant to be an introduction, but our mission is to empower rural and indigenous peoples to restore and protect tropical ecosystems in Central America and Mexico. So we really focus on the Mesoamerican biological corridor as our area of influence. Next slide. And our vision is that rural communities can lead in the creation of a sustainable world for both people and nature. And that is grounded in our core principle, which is the next slide, please. That the active leadership and participation of local communities in forest conservation and climate change adaptation is not only socially just, but truly essential for the long-term sustainability of our planet. We really approach our partnerships and our work with a values-driven approach, and I won't read all of these, and I think we'll get into some of these in the discussion. But we really focus on specific places that are underserved, but that are also of high conservation and social capital value. We work with solidarity with our partners. We're in it for the long term. And we really focus on building trust. We co-design our solutions, building on our many years of experience. We've been around since 1993, but using participatory methods that can really elevate and bring to light the priorities and the perspectives of the communities that we work with, and forging connections between different partners at different levels to bring resources, ideas, knowledge to bear. The next slide, please. And so honing in on that a little bit more, we partner to really build and foster healthy ecosystems and resilient communities. And we do that by connecting, like I said, networks between our partners locally, farmer to farmer, community to community, regionally. We've also bring tools and training regarding each of the solutions that we address, including reforestation, so seeds, approaches on how to best do that, sustainable farming, and connecting and providing access to incentives, not only financial, but social and other types of incentives that can make sustainable practices be there in the long term.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. I think a lot of the things I'm going to say, some of the language is going to look familiar, but there are some differences, which I think is the point of this panel. So this is great. Thank you, Nia and World Rainforest Day, for inviting us to participate in this panel. I'm Teri Allendorf from Community Conservation. Next slide, please. At Community Conservation, we believe that local people are the best stewards, and we promote participation by all members of the community and encourage the formation of community organizations to manage natural habitats and species. And that may be what sets us apart, is our focus on biodiversity, habitats, wildlife, from some other organizations doing community conservation more broadly. And at Community Conservation, we believe that communities are the solution, right? They're not the problem, which is often how we tend to think about communities and their extraction behavior. So we can go into the idea they are the solution. They often, even before we come in, are a solution, already doing great things. But we act as a catalyst to help them create the organizations to in places where biodiversity is threatened. So we bring enthusiasm, information, which often about biodiversity and wildlife, for example, can be lacking in communities. They may not know the context of their wildlife and biodiversity in a broader way. And then we support them to create those institutions, to create the governance to support conservation of habitat and wildlife. Next slide, please. And just to talk about our impact a little bit, we've been around since 1985. We've had over 27 projects in 15 countries, working with over 200 villages to protect over 1 million acres. And like I said, our focus is on habitat and in every place species that in that habitat often. Our founder was a primatologist. In many of the projects that he began, there is an emphasis on primates. There's some examples here. We worked in Latin America, Central America, Africa, Asia. We work all over the place. Next slide, please. And one of the most famous and the first one that got our founder into thinking about community conservation is he was a primatologist. As I said, he was basically a natural scientist, and he wanted to save the howler in the baboon in what they call the baboon in Belize. And he started working with local landowners, and he realized they were the solution, right? So I think a lot of us in community conservation from the natural sciences or biodiversity side come at it from wanting to protect something and realizing communities are the only way to do it. And he was like that also. Next slide, please. So as I said, what makes a lot of us do community conservation, what sort of sets CC apart? And one is we go in recognizing that in every community we've ever worked, people already have conservation values. There's people with a conservation ethic. I mean, almost everyone wants to conserve their general environment, and there's always champions who want to conserve species, who are seeing that species and wildlife are being lost, that their numbers are diminishing, and they want to work to conserve those. But often, as I said, they don't always have access to information about biodiversity, how to monitor, how to learn more about it, how to be sort of like a local scientist. So that's something else we bring to them. And then we help support a process of building capacity so they can do it themselves. So we can leave. We're not in there for the long term, we hope. We hope we can leave them with local partners and their own organizations that have the technical ability to monitor wildlife, to conserve wildlife, but also the governance in place to do that as a community. Next slide, please. And if you like economic arguments, I mean, community conservation, we've seen our projects only cost $12 to $25 per square kilometer. And here's a study for birds globally that starts at $114 per square kilometer. So there's an economic argument for really working with communities because it's efficient and inexpensive. Next slide, please. But the real argument is that there are conservationists in every village. And as a conservation biologist myself, I want to support those people, whether they're in a local village or any NGO or government, to support conservation of biodiversity, which is at the core of all the other things we're talking about in terms of human health, climate change, and all these other sectors. And this is just some examples of people that keep me going every day, right? There's people in every community that that want to do this, and supporting them is what helps me get through every day, even though sometimes things can look kind of bleak. And one example there is Kind Sway, who hopefully will participate in a panel that we're having tomorrow. So just to give you a preview of that a little bit. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Beto Borges, the Director of Forest Trends Communities and Territorial Governance Program, or initiative. We, like our colleagues here with EcoLogic and Conservation, Teri's organization, Community Conservation, our focus is also to establish truthful partnerships with local communities, indigenous and local communities, traditional local communities, Our focus is Latin America, primarily in the Amazon basin, where we have about 240 million hectares of indigenous peoples living in the Amazon basin. We've been doing our work mostly focused. Our main niche of work is really to promote the integrated governance of indigenous lands. If you can pass to the next slide, because really the focus is really working with local communities, indigenous communities, in order to promote the integrated governance of their lands, so that the end result of that is standing forests, a good climate, biodiversity, and all the other ecosystem services that derive from the good stewardship that indigenous peoples have through their traditional practices over the years. And also, very importantly, to support the livelihoods of indigenous peoples and ultimately their rights to their forests. We pursue our work through this focus on indigenous, the governance of indigenous peoples' forests through three main strategies. If you will, please pass to the next slide. Focusing on advocacy, economic self-determination, and cultural integrity. In the area of advocacy, I think I have another slide. You can move on. In the area of advocacy, we've been working with our partners, which are community-based indigenous organizations, working also with organizations that perhaps with a political representation as compared to those that are representing territorial lands. We work with different instances of these representatives of indigenous peoples' organizations and advocacy in to seek to have their rights and interests better represented at evolving policies that affect their rights in one way or the other. Particularly low emission rural development policies throughout the regions that we work, and also seeking to drive more climate and conservation finance to support this integrated governance of indigenous peoples' lands. Next, please. In the area of what we call economic self-determination, we are working with our community partners to really seek to strike the right balance between their traditional economies with the market economy. So seeking to, over time, build economic resilience to really halt the vulnerability that indigenous communities and other communities have to the encroaching pressures upon their territories. And next, please. And in the area of cultural integrity, essentially we're working with our friends at the community level to really bring about initiatives and projects that really support their cultural traditions, so that their cultural traditions and knowledge can be passed from generation to generations. We work in that capacity with medicinal plants. We have an interesting program being carried out for several years around living pharmacies, where elders pass on their knowledge of how to identify, use, and medicinal plants, cultivate and use medicinal plants to younger generations, as well as working with indigenous teachers so that kids can grow up, indigenous kids can grow up feeling proud of their cultural heritage, so they can be strong leaders to promote their rights, defend their rights over the years. Next, I think I'm pretty much done, I believe. So that's a little bit of what we do. Really, again, it's really important to partner with local indigenous communities to promote their rights and the good governance of their forests. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Nia, and everyone with the World Rainforest Day, and our colleagues here, Teri, Barbara, and Mark. We're really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara, Teri, Beto, for introducing yourselves and your organizations. Now that we know a little bit more about you, I think we can start to get into the questions. I do want to give a little bit more context in case we have anyone here who isn't as familiar with conservation type of work. So for some context, 80% of the planet's biodiversity is protected by indigenous communities, and at least a quarter of our planet's land is owned, occupied, or managed by them too. And these numbers are even higher if you factor in local and traditional communities, though it becomes a little bit harder to calculate. But overall, like our panelists have already mentioned, local groups have been at the forefront of conservation for centuries. And many organizations, like those of our panelists here today, recognize this and the knowledge these communities harbor, which I think is where the desire and need for these partnerships stems from. And it's all about finding the most collaborative, culturally appropriate, and sustainable approach on which to build projects. So with our panelists here today, we're going to explore what their partnerships look like, how they come about, what impact they're to have, and how they can be strengthened. So we're going to delve into a conversation now to unpack answers to some of those questions, but we will have time at the end for a Q&A. So if anyone in our audience has any questions for all of our panelists or one of our panelists, feel free to drop them in the chat at any point, or there's also a Q&A pop-up if you want to use that. And we will either weave it into our conversation or we will get to it at the end. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and get started with a very basic question, but I think one that's needed to sort of set the stage. And that question is, what is your role in a partnership with a local community? So what does your organization bring to the table? Let's get started with Teri.
Okay, thanks, Nia. I think I mentioned it in the slides, but what we bring, like I said, is enthusiasm and energy, the knowledge that we want to support them, that there are already people in those communities who either are or want to conserve, biodiversity specifically and habitats and their lifestyles. So we come in with that idea and then help provide information and capacity building, right? So that's where we come in. It's supporting them, we're helping them organize, and that can look very different in every country because of the policies that already exist or because of the situation that might already be there. In a place like Nepal with community forestry, we can really get the institutions already there, the governance is often already in place. And for us there, it's the wildlife component because they don't have much technical and management ability to manage the wildlife, right? That's happening in protected areas in Nepal and not so much across the greater landscape. In other countries like Myanmar, they have some policies in place, but those are relatively new. They're about 30 years behind Nepal in terms of community forestry. So they were really starting from scratch, trying to identify leaders and communities through our partners that you'll hear more from them tomorrow, hopefully, and trying to find those leaders and communities, trying to help support them to create the institutions that don't exist yet. So every place can look a little bit different and have a different starting point, but those are some of the main things and where we start with a community.
Yeah, I think building off of that, we see ourselves as partners and allies, kind of first and foremost. We always work with local partner organizations and through local partner organizations. And we currently have 8 projects in Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico. Marco is our representative, and he works very closely with our local partner in Mexico. So I definitely want him to sort of add his perspective of a project on the ground. But we also bring technical and financial assistance, so that capacity building, the participatory approaches to defining what the challenges are, what the community's priorities are, and how do we together come up with solutions that are locally appropriate, and then how do we find the resources together to make that happen. And a connection to networks, sort of really highlighting, shining a light on those examples that Teri has mentioned, where there are already solutions, there already is energy, commitment to conservation, and how do we, amplify that voice. And Marco, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, probably as Teri and Barbara mentioned, some of the most important things that we do on the field is that we actually voice out what the communities and the people want to say. They have a voice, they have a message, they are doing great things on the field, they're conserving their areas, but sometimes they have difficulties to share their own vision and they lack, for example, the networks to do so. And that's probably some of the main and most important things that we can provide to them. And the most important thing also is trust, because building trust with each other is one of the main aspects about actually sharing and trying to link all these efforts together.
I couldn't concur more with what has been said. I mean, trust. I think trust is everything, isn't it? And and trust is something that you cannot ask for, you know. So it just comes with time, and I think trust is something that we deserve according to our merit, right? Do we merit trust? And
You have to earn it.
pretty much. And with those of us that have been doing this work for quite some time, that have the privilege to work with local communities, know how important that is, because trust is really the backbone of any successful project in the long run. And the way in which we try to build that trust is really coming from a perspective that we don't know it all. You know, we come really eager to learn the realities of our local friends, and not only the realities, but to learn from to drink from the fountain of their knowledge as well, because how deeply knowledgeable indigenous peoples are about managing their natural resource base around them. So what we have to offer is similarly to what our colleagues have said, is technical assistance and finance in project design, in participatory project design, but really seeking to also draw upon their knowledge in the design phase to begin with. Also, over the years, we've been able to also offer the ability to make connections. For instance, in the area that I was speaking earlier about economic resilience, we work with our community partners to develop economic initiatives or community-based enterprises, and work through the development of the value chain from the community all the way to the marketplace. So establishing those connections, we can, no one can speak more on that, how one can do that, but it's very important that you know, that indigenous peoples and local communities have access to those in the marketplace that are willing to properly engage with local communities in ways that are fair, in ways that are culturally appropriate.
Thank you all. I want to actually pull some things that all of you mentioned and sort of build on them with my next two questions. These are really two questions. I'm going to combine them into one. But Teri, you mentioned that a big part of starting up a new project is identifying a community leader. So I'm curious to hear, you know, how do you identify that community leader? When you find someone, how do you ensure that it's somebody who has authority within the community and has that local knowledge? And then the second part of the question being that when you identify that person, what building look like? Beto mentioned that being kind of the backbone of it all, is having that trust. So you find the leader, and then you have to have that trust building process. Can you talk a little bit about both of those steps?
Let's see. There's a lot to unpack there. So again, sort of like the approach is different in every place depending on the context. How we find like a leader and what a leader is varies from place to place. So in some cases, we go in through local NGOs who we've met or who've contacted us, right? Who have a presence, who hopefully have that trust, which we can't be sure of till we get there and sort of see what's going on. But in most cases, we do have wonderful partners in all these projects, right? That are already working there and have worked with the communities. And then, or we work through researchers or scientists, like I said, natural biologists, biologists who've come to us and said, hey, I want to work with the community. I have a project on this species. So that's another way in. So they often already know the community too, and have identified people who want to work on biodiversity conservation. And so there's different ways to enter, but then once we're there with a partner or with whoever has brought us in to introduce us, it is about transparency, right? And that's the beginning of trust. It's just being totally transparent. So often we go in to do conservation projects and different groups will talk about the development aspects, the economic aspects. And that's not really why we're there. We are totally transparent that we're here to conserve the wildlife. That really is our goal. Other groups have more diverse goals, but that's really our goal. We want to help you, if you're interested in this wildlife and learning more about it, in conserving it, we want to help you do that. And I think what we've seen in our projects is that starting with that transparency is really important so that you get the people who are honestly interested in wildlife conservation, because even in a community, a very small village, you're going to have a whole diversity of thoughts and values and experiences and priorities, right? For some people, it is economics. They want to extract more fuel wood from the forest. That's why they want to protect it. For most people, it's a combination of all those things, right? Social, economic, intrinsic value of the environment. And so anyway, I could go on forever about this, right? But that's the basic thing, right? Is having someone who can introduce you and then being totally transparent to begin to build that trust. I'll hand it over to somebody else.
Yeah, I think I want to just clarify to the audience in case anybody joined later or something, but all of our panelists do work with local communities, but they all have sort of different approaches. They work in different countries and with different communities. So we are going to have slightly different experiences here, which I think is going to be what's most interesting about this panel. But does anybody have an experience that is different to what Teri just said?
Just to complement briefly, in our case, we've been working with some of these communities for many, many years, right? In the Amazon, at least the experience in the Amazon and elsewhere in Latin America, they already have their sort of leadership structure that wherein leadership passed from community, from leaders to leader over generations and over the years, through assemblies that the leaders get picked up. So essentially, by the time we arrive, and especially with those organizations that we've already been working with for several years, we already know who the leadership is. But the thing is that there are really good questions to keep in mind when to really determine the legitimacy and the representativeness of a leader. Because a leader is not someone who calls himself or herself a leader. A leader is someone who is picked up by the community to be a leader. And it's important for us that are doing this work to really see that is actually happening, so that we're not deceived or just because someone is really outspoken and claims himself or herself to be a leader, but in reality, has not been the person chosen by the community. So I think listening to the elders and listening to the women, so the gender perspective and how does that reflect into leadership, extremely important as well.
I agreed 100%. Yeah, I think the way you framed your questioning about how do you identify the leader, yes, I think there's the sort of traditional structure that might include, the local NGO and executive director, or the governance authority that was elected, but then there are sort of different levels of leadership, from the women's group to the community groups to the farmers groups. And I think for us, our local field staff are incredibly important in sort of having that presence, being those eyes and ears, and identifying those different levels of leadership, and those people that can be really, really critical and really important in the success of the initiatives, in showing, for example, piloting a certain activity and showing his or her neighbors, this can really work. This is something, worth doing, worth investing your time in. So I think for us, our field staff, and especially with each project, we have field technicians that are usually from the community that speak the native language, the local language, and they're essential as part of that trust building process as well. And I don't know, Marco, if you want to add anything there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, basically what Beto, Barbara, and Teri said, it's like one of the main issues in all the projects. If you don't take consideration about what the community actually wants or what are their goals, you won't gain their trust or even start a project at all. Something that EcoLogic has is, for example, that we are always listening to the technicians and the people on the field. We get the feedback on how we can improve our projects. If something that we are actually doing is not working, we try to fix that and try to get it done. But probably some of the things that we can actually, as one of the most important, is how you gain the trust and what are the basic steps to do that. And That's basically related to transparency, as Teri stated before, and that you have to leave zero expectation about what you're trying to create. You have to have a common goal, share this experience, trying to understand and know that you have to be humble to actually learn from the communities, to actually try to share your own experience, because basically the communities already know what they are doing. They only need some kind of feedback. They need to understand that most of the things that we do come from the field and from the people who actually work on the conservation topics. And their own efforts and activities sometimes aren't actually being shared with different audiences or networks, but that's where the things are happening, where the most important things are happening for conservation. The people who actually work there is one of the most important. The priorities should be taken based on that into consideration.
So at this point, you've all mentioned this element of knowledge harbored by the communities you work with and learning from them just as much as you are there to provide, whether it's technical support or anything like that. So is there an example of indigenous, traditional, or just local knowledge that you've learned from a community that you've worked with that you've now integrated into your approaches, not just in that community, but in your work more broadly?
Maybe I'll start this time. Yes, there are several examples. We're always learning and seeking to integrate, the experience and knowledge of indigenous peoples into our work. One example that I can share, one of the indigenous peoples that we work with in the Brazilian Amazon are the Ashaninka indigenous group. The Ashaninka, it's interesting, that speaks to, it has just something not related to the experience, it just crossed my mind now, which is this notion of political boundaries, right? And indigenous peoples in relation to the boundaries that history has created. The Ashaninka is an example that hopefully one day will no longer be political boundaries and geographic boundaries based on ideology and politics and nation states, and more boundaries will be more smooth boundaries that will be complementary in terms of bringing the richness of each culture as the boundaries merge and cultures benefit from one another. And the Ashaninka people, highly spiritual people, which is something that I think it's very important to embed into our work, the spiritual dimension of how communities relate to the world, and to learn from that, because us coming from a Western society, sometimes that is not in the minds of many of us. I've been working with indigenous people for so many years that it's part of my life as well, in my practice. But anyways, the Ashaninka, their border in the Ashaninka territory expands into Peru, the country of Peru, and to the country of Brazil. That's what I was trying, my mind all of a sudden went into the boundary thing, which is an evidence of the fact that the indigenous peoples they came before most of these countries, and the Ashaninka are there over generations. So there's so much to learn from their generational stewardship of the forests around them. In fact, there is a researcher, Susanna Hatch, she's a professor at UCLA, who has developed this theory that the forest has actually co-evolved with the presence of indigenous peoples. And what we're learning from that and seeking to integrate into our work when it comes to that, from learning from the Ashaninka, is how they go about managing their forests. And we do a lot of work in establishing agroforestry systems And we are combining the Ashaninka science into growing, into recuperating degraded lands, for instance, into sort of the science of around agroforestry, such as the proper intermixing of species, and seeking to use species that are more resilient to pests and this and others. So the Ashaninka, their lands was, a part of their lands was deforested by loggers years ago. And through their science of reforestation, they have been able to reestablish the biodiversity of their forests. And we are integrating that knowledge into the agroforestry systems that we're using. So again, these people that are there before the political boundaries that were established, that are in the forest that is co-evolving with them. And I think it's a privilege, and we can learn so much from this knowledge that indigenous peoples have. And I'll stop there for now.
Yes, similar to what Beto mentioned, we have worked, for example, with some of our indigenous partners in Guatemala, in Totonicapán, to document some of their practices around reforestation and how they're influenced by the phases of the moon and the time of the year, the right time for planting, the right time for harvesting seeds. So that's one very specific example where we've actually documented it with other partners and then shared it with our other partner organizations for them to learn from and apply as well. Agroecological principles as well with agroforestry systems and using different native species, heirloom species. And Marco can tell us a little bit more about a recent example in Oaxaca.
Yeah, just what I was hearing from Beto and the agroforest example, I mean, it's like hearing about the Chinantla project in Mexico and how we actually heard the community people who suggested to use some local crops or wild species from the jungle instead of the more commercial ones, or even the ones suggested by the local institution for reforestation. I mean, if we do respect your own beliefs, knowledge, and cultural heritage, we can even go a step further and try to include the new generations in terms of actually involving the local communities. That's some of the probably most threatening aspects about how to preserve this knowledge and how to actually use the existing knowledge in these new times versus all the information that we have from the scientific area or the experts, as we call them ourselves. But sometimes when we go to the field, we found ourselves with the real experts who actually have the real knowledge and how they are actually using it to preserve and conserve all these beautiful areas. Probably that's one of the most perfect examples about how we're trying to interrelate or integrate the existing knowledge into our own practices. The other one probably is the most recent one, that it's based on how we're doing some measurements on the forest with the help from one expert. And we went to the field, and the people there actually suggested to use a simple branch or a stick to use it instead of the measuring tape. And that was something that they already have, that they knew that it was much more simple than use a measuring tape, but it worked at the time, and we're trying to actually promote it in all the projects to ease this kind of transference of knowledge between projects. But I mean, the knowledge is there, we have to use it, rescue it.
I guess I would just add, I don't have a specific example, but that the complexity of even what is traditional and indigenous knowledge in the communities we work in, working in Africa and Asia, the concept of indigeneity, for example. I've worked mainly in Asia personally, and indigeneity is such a, who's indigenous, what is indigenous in those contexts is much more complex, I think, often than in Latin America, which is one of those interesting things to explore, what it means in these different places and countries and to people. And working in, again, using Nepal as an example, you've got communities where there are recent settlers who maybe have come 20, 30 years ago, living with people who are considered indigenous and have lived there for generations and have some more of that traditional knowledge. And so how you work with these communities that are all living together and having to learn how to govern together is also just sort of an interesting aspect of thinking about traditional and local knowledge, and how even in one community, it can vary so much, just based on individuals maybe in their own interests, but also on these different groups that may coexist together as a community.
I want to jump back just a little bit to something that Barbara and Teri mentioned earlier that I found really interesting. Barbara, you said when you were, I think this was during the original introductions, but you said that a goal for EcoLogic is that, you know, you're there for the long run. And then Teri, you said for you, your goal is to be able to leave, like implement a project and be able to get out. So my question, I guess, is how does a partnership with a local group end? Like, when do you decide it's time to pack up your bags and go? Or do you decide at any point that it's time to pack up your bags and go?
I'll go first just because we're the ones that are ending. We want to end. So maybe it's a simpler sort of little box to talk about. We want it to end because once we sort of see a community with its functioning institutions, it has the knowledge and the capacity to, you know, pick a species, pick a habitat, be able to manage it, have sort of the co-governance or the polycentric governance in place with other institutions that are local to manage it. They know how to monitor, they can enforce laws and regulations, you know, around that habitat. And then they don't need us forever, right? We don't work on those long term. I think livelihoods is a much more complex thing, and it can arise from the projects we work on, and it does, but that's not the part we work on, right? So once that sort of biodiversity piece is in place and communities are functioning and conserving, we do try to leave. We try not to have a long-term presence at each site.
Yeah, I think I didn't intend to say that our goal was to be there in the long term, but our mindset is one of long-term commitment. I think, you know, we don't have a specific sort of end date, but I think for us, the process of building that trust, of building those relationships, often means that our relationship sort of evolves over time, that our partners, you know, and we have a variety of levels of partners. Some have started as just organized communities where we've helped them become a legally established local organization. And now they are very solid, they're very respected, they're doing their own fundraising, and we're more there as an advisor, connector. And in some cases, they're more sophisticated, and we're just helping maybe expand the geographical coverage of the conservation activity into more of a landscape level effort. So yeah, I didn't mean to say like we want to be there in the long term, but I think oftentimes that trust, that relationship building, you know, evolves into a longer term partnership that for us is still worthwhile to invest in, even if our role has evolved and changed. In some cases, like Teri said, if the partner is ready to go and their capacity is there, you know, the partnership ends. Some partnerships have ended because there's been, let's say, the partners no longer have the trust of the community. There's been some sort of suspicions of kind of self-dealing or corruption, and you know, we end the partnerships. Certainly, it's not always perfect, and I think that's worth recognizing as well. But I think just having that mindset of we're not here for 1 or 2 years. It's not a in and out. It's not we're coming to tell you, you know, our experience, get this project done and leave, but sort of be there as partners and allies.
Marco, Beto, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, not necessarily. I think it depends on case by case. You know, myself.
Yeah. In the case for EcoLogic, probably it's something kind of different in each country, but probably something that it's actually related is that it goes both ways. It's not only related just to EcoLogic. We also talk with the local partner and with the community. We do value the feedback, as I mentioned before, and based on that, we set common goals and we establish what are going to be the objectives. We do value if we want to continue with the work of, we are going to keep on learning of our own experience, and based on that, we actually renew our own activities yearly. So basically, as Barbara mentioned, it's not just a project, it's more like a long-term relationship based on a mutual agreement. I mean, even if we want to stay in one side, we can force it if the local partner or the community doesn't want to. We have to hear them, and based on that, we opt to or not to stay with them.
Yeah, I just one thing actually that just occurred to me in this question about long term versus how long do you stay? I think it really depends on the need, and depends how much they want us to stay, how much they need us to stay. I think we all share here, through organizations, that the commitment that we have towards working with local people, that will never change. Because I don't think we casually are doing this work. The commitment is not hard, right? And as long as there will be communities in this planet, I think we'll be, if it's not with one, if it's another one, hopefully we can, because there's so much work to be done, and hopefully the ideal is that a community achieves that point of self-sufficiency, that they don't need the work that we collectively can offer, and we can offer that to others that are interested and they can benefit from it. I think that's essentially the driving sort of guidance for all of us, I would think.
Probably something that I would like to add, based on Beto's comment, in the case of EcoLogic, we're talking about specific areas that we attend to. In the case of Mexico, for example, where we decided to work in the Chinanto project, we aimed for a specific area and what the threats to that conservation area were. And based on that, as Beto mentioned, moving from one community to another is based on how the threats are being addressed at that moment or at this time. Based on that, we asked the communities if they wanted to work with us, and based on that, we kept on moving from one community to the other. But that's based on trust, and once you get the trust from one community, probably the other one will like to work with you. But it's not a forced relationship; it's an agreement that you have to make with them in order to actually fulfill a common goal, as I mentioned before.
I'm curious to know if outside of the dynamic that you have with a partner community, there's also the question of the government of the country that you're working in. And if in the case of Indigenous communities, for example, there's been cases where Indigenous groups aren't represented or their rights aren't recognized at the government level. So I'm wondering if in any of your experiences, you've had government or institutional pushback or a lack of support when working with communities in certain countries? And if so, how do you navigate that? Not all at once. Barbara, do you want to start, or Beto?
Maybe Beto, you can start, since you guys do advocacy work in particular.
Oh God. Well, governments are a tricky thing, right? So they perhaps the main difference between, not the main difference, one of the most important difference between working with governments and working with communities is that communities stay over generations, right? I've been working with, there is one particular indigenous group that I work with them for the longest, the Yawanawa in Brazil. I've been working with them for the past probably 25 years in the Brazilian Amazon. They're, part of my family. We have this bond, right, of trust and friendship. And I've seen their kids grow, and over the years. Whereas governments, typically 3 to 4 years, you change the government, and and then the sort of their motivation, the political will, and hidden agendas change with the government. Then you have to navigate. Right now, it's very difficult. Speaking for Brazil, you just open the news, and the news speak for themselves, right? I'm not saying that this is that other governments in the past were not detrimental to indigenous peoples. There's this book by Eduardo Galeano, a famous Uruguayan writer, speaks a book called The Open Veins of Latin America. So that speaks to not to just, because I think it's all very easy to now just denounce Bolsonaro here, and I'm not pleased with the way in which his government is treating indigenous peoples. So I would be crazy to be in favor of that, because you have more than 20,000 miners, illegal miners invading the Yanomami territory in Brazil, and trying to stop the demarcation of indigenous peoples' territories and this and that. But this is not an isolated point in history, you know, and I highly recommend people interested in Latin America to read this book by Eduardo Galeano, The Open Veins of Latin America, that speaks to the history of exploitation, of suffering imposed by the United States, imposed by other governments, and by their own governments, the dictatorships. So it's a history of pressures of disregard to indigenous people's rights. So in that context, and then added the macroeconomic policies that are brought upon by the governments. So it's difficult to really advocate for the rights of indigenous peoples, because the great majority of governments don't have the rights of indigenous peoples, the best rights of indigenous peoples as their priority. Priorities are different. Even in the best of intentions, they still have a lot to learn. So I think that our experience has been difficult over the years, dealing with different governmental agencies, but that's not impossible to deal with them. I mean, we have to really use rely on the legal framework, and that's what we try to do in our advocacy work. But essentially, it's not really us. We seek to support the advocacy efforts of indigenous peoples themselves by providing legal support when that's possible, and also finding those people within government agencies that also are trying to do good work. There's a lot of people trying to do good work across all kinds of governmental agencies in the countries where we work. And again, it's a matter of seeking to build partnerships, and also to use the recourse of the law. And fortunately, there exist national laws, international conventions. I think that we have to be to make use of that in order to, you know, to overcome the challenges that we have.
And just to add a little bit to that, at like smaller scales, thinking of even like within a district and a forest department within a small area, anytime you start talking about a community having power to manage, no matter what the context, that means the forest department probably has to give up some power or some management, or maybe even resources, right? So even at that the small scale, it can be really hard, and there's often pushback from local offices, right? Because they don't want to give up what they perceive as power. So it seems like sometimes a zero-sum game to them rather than additive or being able to support each other. So that's something we've run into in the field. And you need champions in every, whether the community or the forest department or whatever department you're working with, right? Without some champions, it can be hard. And people who really buy into communities, right? That's a huge barrier too, is sometimes people don't really buy into communities being able to do this work, especially with biodiversity, right? So people don't believe communities can manage tiger because it's a species that ranges across huge areas, and communities would just want to kill it, right? So convincing people that communities really want to help do this can be hard.
Well, in the case of Mexico, there has been a lot of changes in these recent years about legislation, about how the communities can get involved in terms of rights and the use of the land. Probably when we're talking about the use of the land, that's another difficult topic to even address. However, in the case of the Chinantra project, we try to involve local agencies in our activities. We try to at least invite them or to know what we were doing, because we aren't thieves or we aren't doing something illegal. We have to promote our own activities. We have to give visibility to the communities and the things that we do. And in that aspect, we have to also involve their local agencies to explain them that their labor is important, that the community's labor is important, and that we have to share all the work. We have to share also the results. We have to share the work, and in those terms, we can actually present results at the different levels. I mean, if we succeed in a project, the local agencies can present the results as something that they can also contribute in terms of conservation. So that is probably one of the most key important aspects in the Mexico project, this kind of involvement, even if just the presence of the local institution at some workshop, or if we invite them to give like the start of the project or at some ceremony, it's important to have them there, because if we involve them, we give them at least a space, a voice for them to voice their own concerns or things that we can probably do wrong. They can also give us suggestions how to present ourselves and work with the community. So it's all an agreement in terms of how we can work together. I mean, we aren't competing with the local institution. We have to work in conjunction with all of them, and we have to share the same goal in terms of our own activities and efforts.
Barbara, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think what Marco was the example kind of alludes to that power dynamics that Teri mentioned at the local level and with like the National Forest Service, those types of agencies. And I think, you know, we don't work at the national level. Our niche is communities and, you know, kind of municipalities in terms of government. And I think that the challenge of kind of the political cycles and government changing and mayors changing has been a bit of an obstacle at times, but again, kind of with our local staff, our local presence, for example, in one project in Honduras, the mayor decided to sort of adopt the community-based watershed management model because he saw that they were being very successful, and that was the main problem that he had with his constituents was access to water. And so he decided to learn from this community-based model, apply it to the watershed in his region. But then when his term was up, it sort of like hit a little bit of a roadblock. But we were able to get kind of the next mayor to sign up. And now it's been about 2 or 3 cycles of different mayors, and it's almost now like a given that they will participate. So that's an example of a roadblock overcome.
Okay, thank you. I want to encourage the audience, if they have any questions, to just throw it in the chat or in the Q&A so we do have time to get to them before this panel is over. That being said, I do still have some questions. I want to talk a little bit about funding, because I know when we had our call prior to this panel, just to prepare, that was a big thing that came up. So let me set the stage a little bit, but a huge step in any project is securing funding, which often can come from large foundations or government agencies and potentially with many strings attached. So certain results identified by the funders that need to be met or areas of work that need to be prioritized. And this can translate into organizations like yours potentially not being able to access those funds because of the stringent and potentially arbitrary outcomes needed, or if you do receive funding, it could translate into culturally inappropriate requirements being imposed on the groups you partner with. So I'm curious to hear how you navigate the funding structures that exist and what the main barriers that you run into are. Let's start with Teri.
Okay, I was trying to think of I think my quick answer is, because we are so focused on communities, we found that means it is small pots of money that really allow you to focus on a community and building their capacity, right? So we're talking grants of 20,000, 30,000, which makes it very hard to be sustainable. Even though I say we want to get in and out, that still isn't, we don't always have enough to stay the 2 to 5 years that it might take, right, depending on the situation. So for us, because it is community-based, I would say that's very limiting. I mean, that said, we are a small organization, and you know, for various reasons, but we haven't really tapped into much larger funding that would allow us to, and I don't see it out there to allow us to do the kind of work we're doing, actually, for all the reasons you said. So not a very satisfying answer, but I look forward to hearing what Beto and Barbara and Marco have to say about it, because I think their institutions are larger than ours, so their organizations.
Barbara, will you do the honor, and Marco? I'll follow you.
Sure. Well, I think generally what Teri said about the sizes of grants that are more likely to be supportive of community-based processes is also the case for us. I mean, we've had all sorts of different experiences, but you know, one example, one funder. So we have a partner, an indigenous partner in Guatemala, who their governance changes completely every year. They have an election, the board completely changes every year. That's part of how they do it. That's their system. And one funder said, no, I don't think that's sustainable. I think they need to change that. And we won't, you know, give you a grant unless they develop a different way of carrying out their elections. So of course, you know, that was not something that we were interested in changing. That was a long time ago, and I do think there's been a lot of evolution from funders around thinking on these matters. But it's, you know, just one of the challenges that we faced. Another is, you know, some of our partners are, you know, have their indigenous traditional governance structure, but they're not legally registered as a nonprofit or an NGO in their country. And that can be a big obstacle for them to apply to sources of funding. So oftentimes in that case, you know, if it's worth applying for, you know, we'll kind of be the vehicle for the funding. Some donors are very specific about, for example, showing expenses and you know, receipts, for example. Like if we're holding a workshop in a very remote community and we're buying the food from like a local woman who made the food in her home, and some donors will want, you know, a very formal receipt with you know, the equivalent of you know, IRS tax receipts, and you know, that's not possible. So we, you know, in those cases we try to educate the donors about the real dynamics, how things work in the field, and you know, how we can possibly come up with solutions that address their concerns, but in a way that is appropriate to the communities.
I agree with all that that Teri, Barbara said. You know, this question on funding, it's a complex one, right? In our view, beginning with the flow of funding, I used to be a funder myself. I used to work for a foundation here in San Francisco, and I was very involved at the time that I was a donor with this organization called Grant Makers Without Borders. I was a co-chair of that. I think that's where we actually met for the first time. Now I remember it, with a good crowd there. So what I experienced as a donor, was something bizarre in a sense, because there was a lot of goodness, you know, just to be able to give grants out. That feels great. At the same time, you know, I learned something that I was only able to learn as a donor. I was a program officer for 3 years in a row, very much involved in grant giving and all of that. It's this thing where that we call areas of interest of foundations, right? Foundations, they have that, generally speaking, I'm not making a generalization, but generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that funders have areas of interest that are, let's say, through a process that they have, a strategic visioning process, or sometimes is a a family foundation that they have their vision of the world, and then when it changes the new generation of the family, or they have a newer vision of the world and gets adapted. My point is that these areas of interest, they're somewhat cyclical. They change from maybe perhaps on average every 5 years. Funders, they have some funders that go through this deep strategic visioning process that sometimes, I'm not going to name any funders here, but there's some that it's so, they go, oh, when is the new vision coming out, so we can actually understand what you're doing, so we can apply, right, to see if it fits our work. Oh, we're still revisioning our vision. I said, okay, well, so that is an issue, because and because often this process that funders go through is influenced by other funders that are going through the same thing. So there's this peer process, and so what I got from that, in addition to sort of the complexities and while the world is changing and funding is needed, and funders sometimes get too absorbed in their processes, and that when solutions are already, a lot of the solutions are already very clear, what needs to be done is very clear. So I hear nowadays, you probably all heard this, there is this new trend, natural-based solutions. Everybody now is talking about natural-based solutions, be it the funding community, be it corporate giving programs, the market. Everybody's trying to do business from now, get a competitive advantage based on nature-based solutions. I think that this emphasis on nature-based solutions has really increased as a result of the pandemic. But wait a minute, indigenous peoples they have nature-based solutions over generations. Why do we need to have lengthy and extremely expensive processes within dynamics within funders to determine, oh, now this is really our vision of the world, as if they're scholars, as if they have the proper way to realize impact on the ground. When I think, speaking from a former funder myself, and I find now that challenge, that I understand how that works, because I was trying to challenge that when I was a funder, but it was very difficult. And then and then we're given this sort of, when they finally arrive at what the new area of funding is, on the current areas of funding is, us seeking for funds, we have to make our projects fit into that box of, this is how we think solutions should come about. And often, the great majority of times, there are some exceptions. The Territorial Foundation, for instance, is a new foundation that, to the extent that I know, is coming with a different approach, as it is the 10-year facility as well, which is not necessarily a foundation. It channels funds from Ford Foundation, other larger foundations. But then organizations like ours, we have to fit into that format. It's like, when you don't find the proper size of shirt for you, and you have to fit into that shirt, and with sometimes clashes with what the real solutions can be put in place. So what I would hope to see from the funder community is that we become more imaginative, to find ways that funding, the guidelines for funding, can be done in a more participatory way with the leaders from local communities. Not just us here from the civil society, from organizations, but all the way down to the source, where nature-based solutions have been coming from over generations. And then on top of that, there are other sort of more operational things. So when you look at just the United States alone, only 2% of all the international funding getting out of the US, only 2% of all philanthropy dollars, 2%. I believe the US is still the wealthiest country in the world, perhaps, right? But 2% is going overseas. 98% that this is figured from some years ago, it may have changed. Hopefully it's more, it could be less, is going overseas. So, and that's also something that it would be great for funders to be, if the problems that we have today are global problems, right? When are we when are we going to stop thinking in an isolated, self-centered way as societies and expect that there is a change? They expect there is climate change. They expect that indigenous peoples, as they are the best stewards of forests, that they can do, that their stewardship can be supported and be given the resources that are needed, not only for them, but for all of us. And here we're giving 2%. So, and then there are questions about capacity of local indigenous peoples organizations in order to absorb. When this little bit of funds go out, oftentimes go through, now climate change, don't get me started talking about climate change, because that is very, it needs a lot of improvement, because a lot of the money is going to climate change are going to governments. There is this new program now, I think it's well-intentioned, LEAF, where the United States, Norway, and England, they committed $1 billion with companies to put towards climate change. But the bulk of that money is going to the hands of governments, local governments. So a lot of trust is placed upon local governments, and where you expect to have benefit sharing programs. But history has shown that more participation is needed, not to speak of corruption, right? At the local level. There's more to say, but I think I've already said a lot on this. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge. But there is an opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Beto. And thank you, all of you. I want to quickly switch to audience questions because I didn't have the Q&A pop-up open and I didn't realize there were so many audience questions. So I'm going to ask that one of you take one question at a time, just so we have time to get through as many audience questions as possible. So let's start with the first one that came in, and whoever wants to take it, just go ahead, and then we'll do the next person for the next question and so on. I think some of these are more specific to wildlife conservation, things like that, so we can sort of split it thematically. But the first question is, what have you tried when partnering with local communities that hasn't worked very well? Whoever wants to speak on it, go ahead. No one? We can move to another question and come back to that one later.
Were you trying to say something, Teri? But your mic was muted.
Oh, Teri, you're muted.
Muted. Sorry, I opened up the Q&A and it seemed to have messed up all my my buttons. I was just going to say that I think it came out sort of when we were talking that if the community if it doesn't work very well, and it's probably because the community maybe doesn't work or it isn't in a situation to work. So my guess is, I know for us, we probably wouldn't work there. It's not a good situation. So anyway, just kind of repeating what I think has already come up for that one.
We have a question that I think goes back to one of our earlier discussions, but what would you consider as long-term involvement with communities, and how do you evaluate when a community is ready to sustain the project on their own? Do you have check-ins after you leave the community, and the ability to readjust programs throughout their implementation? So kind of a lofty question there, but if one of you wants to take that.
I can briefly speak on that. I'm thinking one project specifically, just as an example, with this Yawanawa group that I mentioned. We helped them establish their brand for the indigenous women. They formed this cooperative to bring to market artisanal work. And we invest with them in creating the brand and brought their, nowadays they have beautiful bio jewelry that they make. It's now sold in online by this company Tucum, Tucum. You can Google that, Tucum, Indigenous art. So you'll be able to see their jewelry there. And they launched this brand, Hai Chi Hu, the name of the brand. And at that point, we established a market connection. They began realizing sales. They have their brand, and so they already have an internal governance process through which they're channeling the proceeds to the different families and all that. We sort of had an evaluation meeting with them, and we concluded that, okay, so we did what we could do. I think it's important for us to realize, us civil society organizations, NGOs, to realize, okay, this is where we can, this is what we could do in relation to that project. This is all we could have done. Help them organize the business, create a brand, making the connection to the buyer. They're selling. So now it's really up to them. If this is, they're excited about it, but I think that we have to be careful not to, once we create something, not to want to just make sure that just because we help in the process, that we also always need to be there. And that if for some reason they decide to switch to something else, it's their own idea. It's their own decision. So I think that's, in that case, we just decided to step out because we, with them, concluded that we were no longer needed.
Can I add something? Yeah, I think like Marco mentioned, for us, it's that process of sort of joint planning at the outset, and then kind of yearly evaluations of where we're at towards achieving the shared objectives, and deciding whether we've gotten there or there's some new element, new dimension that we want to continue working on together. One example of a kind of a short-term engagement was a very small community of fisher folk community in Guatemala, where we worked with them also to establish kind of an alternative to relying entirely on fishing to do a sustainable tourism enterprise. And that one, again, kind of like Beto mentioned, it was established, they were getting business even from international visitors. And unfortunately, that was right at the start of COVID. So they were very strongly affected by that. And, our staff has continued to kind of check in with them and try to provide support as much as possible when things have been completely closed. But hopefully they'll be able to get back up and running once the situation improves.
Thank you. And Teri, I think this question might be most specific to you, but if anybody else wants to have a go, feel free. This is kind of a lofty question as well, but there are many conservation projects and initiatives supposed to protect large areas of natural habitats, including the recent idea of having 30% of the Earth's surface defined as protected areas. How important is it to recognize customary rights and guarantee land rights to local communities? In other words, how effective could governments, NGOs, or the private sector be in comparison to communities, given or if there were a hypothetical equality in terms of availability of resources?
I think it started with talking about that 30% of land being protected, right? And I think the biggest answer is we can't do it without recognizing the rights of communities and their motivations to conserve, right? Because you look at the corridor idea, in many places it is communal land, or even if it's private, they have to be working together for conservation. So we've got to be working with the communities. In a place like Nepal with a landscape conservation, again, it's community forestry that's in between protected areas, right? That allows you to get up to 30%, which they have now in Nepal, right? Just through protected areas, and then community forests on top of it, you're up to 50 or 60% of the land being pretty well protected. So you can't do it without them, right? So it's critically important both for achieving conservation, changes in climate change, all that stuff, but also just because of the ethics of it. So for every reason I can think of, it's important.
I'm muted. I'll throw in one final question and then leave enough time for Teri to introduce her event that Community Conservation is hosting tomorrow as part of Rainforest Ambitions. But final question that just came in. What is the future of online giving or crowdsourcing to support Indigenous and local projects, and how do we get there? So I think sort of hopping a little bit back to the topic of funding, but specifically thinking about crowdsourcing and how that can play into sort of the shared mission here. Anybody who wants to speak on that?
I'm not sure exactly how to answer it. A lot of our funding does come from private donors and trying to do different forms of, peer-to-peer, or, we're sort of exploring some of that. But again, it can be hard. I think people maybe do want to give more locally, right? And making, like Beto was pointing out, how little money goes overseas. So making that argument and finding an audience that understands why giving to communities so far away is important to them here. So I'm not sure that's what their question is about, but in terms of our thinking of grants and foundations versus donors and funding that way, it's all kind of a hard trek. It's not easy.
There's one platform that we use that's called Global Giving, where currently we are sort of the vehicle for presenting our projects and our work, but it's something that we've been kind of exploring with some of our partners, the potential of them being directly on that platform. And it's, yeah, I think for me, that's one example of a really great tool that is really trying to bring the voices of local communities and local projects from across the globe to international donors that want to invest directly. So just one example.
Yes, there's also this Global Green Grants Fund. I mean, they re-grant major grants between $5,000 to $15,000, I believe. Still, that is the amount, and they receive larger amounts. There are other affinity sort of grant giving organizations throughout Latin America. So I mean, crowdfunding is a great thing, but I think, but again, yeah, I mean, it depends on who is really putting together, and depending on what they're using the money for. I mean, and if they're be great for people that are in their early years in their careers to just learn the local languages and go there and help the community-based organizations establish their own ways to channel more monies directly. Because no matter what we do, I think we all based here in the North, we have, it's expensive to do what we do. So there's also overhead costs and this and that. Even this, I'm sure grant makers without borders, that's also a good way to channel funds. Grant makers without borders, I'm not sure if they do grant. I think they only advocate for grants to be made overseas. This is what we used to do. I meant to say global green grants. The thing is that is the overhead that European organizations, be it civil society and funders, have, as well as North American organizations. So I'm an advocate for more funds to be given directly to local organizations in the globe, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, because the money will go along, will stretch farther. But again, if the local capacity is still not there to absorb the money properly, so it still hopefully won't do harm, but I'm not sure it will be as effectively used.
And I want to just wrap up today's session with one final question directed to all of you. In just a couple sentences, what are some ways that the global community, the world rainforest community, the people in our audience today can support your work or the work of your partner communities? I think we've all sort of hit on it by now, but in just a few sentences, how can we continue to support the work you do?
Volunteer, bring your skills and networks. And I'm really glad to hear that Teri will be doing a panel and that some of the local organizations will be participating, because I think for me that's really, really important, that the indigenous and local communities can talk about themselves for themselves, and that there'll be more access to these kinds of forums, and just kind of remove the barriers and make it easier for them to participate directly.
Yeah, I think just, yeah, talking about our partners and what Beto said, I think one model we're looking at for our organization is to think of ourselves as a hub, right? For a lot of these, so many people are doing such great work that parallels what we're doing, or they've been partners, or they could be partners for our goals and mission, and we can support them in different ways than directly supporting projects, right? Because they're sitting in those countries. In Myanmar, for example, our colleagues, they can get funds from the embassies, they can get funds from the EU, things that, you know, that are appropriate for them in their place. They can almost get more money than we can sometimes if we're just trying to directly fund projects in the field, right? So that model of supporting them and figuring out ways we can support them, they already are getting funds. Can we help amplify that? Can we create a network that amplifies their voices in their own context, but working together? So, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So maybe just to plug that a little bit, is that we are going to be talking with our partners tomorrow in these different contexts and the different ways that all the questions we talked about today, but also sort of, you know, their different contexts and what they're dealing with. So it'll be interesting to sort of see what they say tomorrow. So I invite everyone. Sorry to interrupt Beto and Marco. I kind of cut off that last question by leaping into my pitch, so I'll stop.
No, by all means, sounds great. Yeah, well, what people can do, I think, is I have a friend, actually a spiritual leader that I follow. One of the things he said is that everywhere that he goes, he puts respect in front of him. You know, he goes there, the respect is in front of him. Respect, 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 respect. Let's respect indigenous peoples and local communities. What does that mean? When we go to later on to the supermarket, when about to grab something that we're going to buy, okay, where is this coming from? Where is respect in this cup? Where is respect in the beef that we buy? Where is respect in the products that we buy? Is that causing deforestation? Is that causing the invasion of indigenous peoples, local communities' lands? I think it's a great way to go about supporting indigenous peoples, is by advocating on their behalf through our practice. It's very easy to say. It's very easy to, you know, to put a finger at politicians, to put a finger at anyone, but it's harder to just change what we do. I think we all have a way to support indigenous peoples through our purchasing power, and that's one of the things that countries hear the most, politicians hear the most. Really try to find out what the corporations in this country and global corporations are doing, in which ways they're being supported by our governments. And we also have a say in that through our voting. Let's vote to those leaders that can actually bring about the changes that we need. You know, the changes that we need are changes that will preserve biodiversity so that we can avoid future pandemics, that will support the rights of indigenous peoples because they have the same rights to resources like we do. Let's pick up the United Nations Declarations of Human Rights and be familiar with it. What does that mean? And just reach out to your local representatives. Ask he or she, have you ever read the Declaration of Human Rights? How does that influence your work as a politician? So we have the rights through our voting, political rights. We have the rights through our purchasing power, and we can also do more. We can also reach out and see if we're called for that, to, you know, figure out ways, study, and increase our ability to, you know, one day perhaps work with this local community indigenous peoples and provide some support. So I think these are some of the things that I think people can help with. And of course, I think offer, if you're so moved, and reach out to one of us here and engage, and also support NIA, so that you have more support and the Friends at Rainforest Partnership, that you can keep on reaching out, you know, more and more people that have this love for nature, you know. So let's all continue to hold hands and unite and embrace this earth, because we don't have another earth. waiting for that. This is it. We have to resolve it right here. Thank you so much for having us.
And actually, if I can just add on to that, in a concrete way, another thing we can do is if you are someone who likes community conservation and you give to organizations that say they do it, like the big environmental NGOs, for example. So maybe this is slightly more specific to biodiversity, but everyone says they're doing community stuff, right? Every group. And maybe as a donor or someone who's interested, just ask them exactly what they're doing. Look at the verbs they're using, right? Are they actively building the capacity of communities? Are they doing more community adjacent or community related? Like often I've actually done what I call community-based audits, trying to look at budgets that I can find and say, okay, they say they're conserving this species and how much money is going to communities to help do that. And a lot of the activities are sort of adjacent to communities, or it is about livelihoods or just doing some studies or something, rather than building their capacity to study and to monitor and to, things that really invest in individuals in the community. So anyway, that's another thing you can do, is just be really thoughtful about who you give your money to and make sure they're really creating community conservation and not just sort of adjacently supporting them.
Yeah, basically what Teri, Beto, and Barbara said, it's very important. And probably another thing that I will add is that taking action is also one of the main aspects of these, not only a call of action, but get involved into action. As Barbara mentioned, be a volunteer, share the message, be a story in terms of conservation. I mean, you can help, you can share a link and get involved with the organization. But if you get invited, if you have the opportunity to live in the real flesh and the real life, how the conservation is being done, try to take action. Because as Barbara mentioned one time, to me, probably we're doing one small step at a time, but that small step can make and become a bigger step for all if we all work together.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I want to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists. I've put contact information in the chat, so to our audience, I encourage you to check out the websites, get in touch if you feel so inclined, and there's also the link for the community conservation event tomorrow that Teri talked about. That's our first event of day 3 of Rainforest Ambitions. So I encourage you all to attend that as well, or check out what else we have on the program. And that is all for this event. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for being here and sharing so much of your experience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow.
Un aplauso para Nia.
Bye.
Abrazos.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye,
Peace and
everybody.
health.
Bye.
Have a good
Cheers.
one.
Bye.
Yes, thank you.